everyone. Okay, so this is the second part of interpreting ABGs, and in this video I'm going to be focusing on partial compensation. In the last video I talked about knowing your ABG values and just basically doing a quick summary, just saying how everybody has a first, middle, and a last name. So based on your values, you can assign them a first name, a middle name, and a last name to get the entire interpretation. If you want to know more about it, then feel free to go back to my last video. Okay, so moving on, partial compensation. So what if both your bicarb and your PaCO2 levels are abnormal? You can't do what we did in the last example in the first video. So in this case, we will compare both the bicarb and the PaCO2 to the pH. Now what I wrote here is that I'm comparing the metabolic, or the bicarb, similarly to an elevator, while the respiratory is more like a seesaw. What I mean by that is if you compare your pH and your, for example, your bicarb, and you see that both of them have increased, like an elevator, then the problem is usually metabolic. Now, if you compare the pH and the respiratory, and the pH is increasing while the respiratory is decreasing, like a seesaw, then the problem is usually respiratory. So, let's do an example. Let's say your pH is 7.56. Your bicarb, HCO3 is 36, and your PaCO2 is 50. Okay, well, let's do what we did in the last video and assign the first, the middle, and the last name. Okay? So taking a look at the pH, we know that it is abnormal. But let's hold off on the first name first, okay? We know that it is alkalosis, so we know the last name is alkalosis. Let's just fill that in right now. Alkalosis. Sorry, I usually spell better than this, I swear. Okay, so now let's take a look at the PaCO2 and the bicarb. We know that they're both abnormal, so let's compare them back to the pH. The pH is increasing. How about the bicarb? Bicarb is usually between 22 and 26, right? So we know this one's also increasing. Well, we know we have the answer right off the bat, but let's just keep going. The PaCO2, usually between 35 and 45, has also increased. So since we know that the metabolic is like an elevator, and that if the pH increases and the bicarb increases, then the problem is usually metabolic. Now the reason I held off on the first name is because, unlike my last video where I just said it's compensated or uncompensated based on whether the pH was within the normal values or not, in this case, it will always be partially compensated. Okay? It's partially compensated. Well, it's partially because the PaCO2 and the bicarb levels are abnormal, and partially compensated because the pH is still unnormal. There is no such thing as partially uncompensated, okay? I made that mistake too, and I got that wrong. So now I remember. It's been ingrained in me forever. Okay, let's just do another example. So, example number 2. Let's say the pH is 7.6. The PaCO2 is 13. And the bicarb, sorry, I don't know why I keep doing this, HCO3 is 16. Okay? So now what? Well, we still need our first, middle, and last name. So taking a look at the pH, we know that it is increased. So is alkalosis. Now, these two values are abnormal. So we know that's going to be a partial compensation. Okay, so now let's take a look in more detail and compare the pH to the PaCO2, and again the pH to the bicarb. So we know this is increased, and we know the PaCO2 is decreased. Now the bicarb is also decreased. We know it can't be metabolic now because it's not an elevator. Both of them aren't increasing or decreasing. But we know it's respiratory in this case because while the pH is increasing, the bicarb is decreasing. So like the seesaw I mentioned, the middle name would be respiratory. So the full name of this person in the land of ABGs will be partially compensated respiratory alkalosis. Okay, so I hope this kind of made sense to you. Sorry, my handwriting is kind of weird and kind of did some weird spelling mistakes. I swear I'm not usually like that. But yeah, I hope this made sense to you, and I hope you learned something from it. Feel free to ask me any questions. And yep, thanks.